Hello biology students, we're going to do Lab 318 on photosynthesis and respiration. Your first task is to look over the lab sheet and perhaps print it out so you can fill it out while you're watching the video. The first thing we're going to do is go to the Bioman website. So click this link. All right, we're at the Bioman website and we are looking at this big idea called photosynthesis, which transforms light energy into stored chemical energy. We're going to use the model to illustrate this by using light energy to break the bonds in water molecules. We're going to drag the light energy to the water molecules and basically take those water molecules apart into oxygen and hydrogen. And we got some chemical energy released here. This chemical energy release allows plants to recombine the elements to make new molecules, including glucose, an important form of stored energy. So we're going to drag all our molecules into kind of a box here. I think of this as kind of getting ready to cook. We're putting all our ingredients kind of in those little dishes you see on the cooking shows. In cooking, it's called mise en place. So we're kind of tidying up here and getting all our atoms in place. In real, it doesn't work quite this way. Biochemistry is a little bit more complicated than just chopping up water and putting all the ingredients in little dishes, but we'll simplify it here since this is high school biology. So we've got 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. You might need that. So now we'll use some of the chemical energy we produce to break bonds in carbon dioxide so we can form glucose later. So let's break those bonds. Oh, we got to do that in the next. So we're going to break the bonds in carbon dioxide using some chemical energy that we stored earlier from breaking up water. And we're going to store some more molecules here. I started too early there. So we're going to tidy up here and put all of our molecules. You can see that carbon has joined the molecule count here. Carbon, of course, is from carbon dioxide. Plants are actually made largely of air. They pull carbon dioxide out of the air to make glucose and other chemicals or other compounds out of what's in carbon dioxide, and they also pull water from their roots. So they're pulling carbon dioxide from the air and water from their roots. And when we're all done here, we're going to have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 18 oxygens. Now, if we're going to make glucose, you know that the formula for glucose is C6H12O6. So we have a bunch of extra oxygen here that the plant doesn't need to make glucose. So in order to kind of tidy up before we start making glucose, we make oxygen. Now, the plant doesn't make oxygen for animals. Animals and other organisms need oxygen from the air, but plants don't make oxygen for us. It's a waste product of photosynthesis. The real point of photosynthesis for plants is glucose. And since they've taken in extra oxygen to make that glucose, they release it as O2 gas into the air, and that's what we breathe. Thanks, plants. So we made 6 molecules of oxygen gas. You might need to write that down. 6 molecules of oxygen gas. Now we have the right formula here for glucose. We have C6H12O6. That's the formula for glucose. So we've put our oxygen gas into the air as a plant. And we made 6 molecules here, so we're going to tidy those up into our box here. You're breathing those molecules of oxygen right now. So you might want to take a look at this count here before we move forward. we've noticed that C6H12O6 is the formula for glucose. So we're going to use those molecules, those 6 carbons and 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens to make some glucose here. And we did this in an earlier lab, so hopefully it should be familiar. Hopefully you're noticing that glucose is a ring. It's got 5 carbons in the ring and 1 kind of hanging off on the side. It's got 1 oxygen in the ring that's attached to 2 other carbons. And the rest of the oxygens are attached to just 1 carbon. Glucose is got some polarity because of a little bit of the oxygen, so glucose dissolves well in water, which is great because that's how our blood distributes glucose. So we're going to take the chemical energy and we're going to make glucose. All right, so we stored the energy of sunlight, and through a number of processes we stored that energy from sunlight as glucose, as a plant. And that's what photosynthesis is all about. Making glucose, we made 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. So 1 molecule of glucose, 6 molecules of oxygen. That was task 1. Now we're going to start task 2. The questions for task 2 are on this part of the lab sheet. So you should be down here on questions 10 and 11 for part 2. So now we click on task 2, and we're going to talk about how we can rearrange the molecules in food to make amino acids. So you notice that plants have glucose, we have glucose, other organisms have glucose, but we need to make other things out of that glucose, like your body needs proteins for things like your nose and your ears and your hair, and all of the enzymes that make your body function, that manage all the chemical reactions in your metabolism. And so we can take these atoms out of the glucose, and it's a much more complex process that's shown here. There's a lot of biochemical wangling and rearranging that goes on. And you can see that in glucose, we have carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. It's a carbohydrate. Remember, carbohydrates contain carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. But we're missing something here in the amino acid. All amino acids, which proteins are made out of amino acids, have an amine group on the end. And so in order to get that amine group, we need a nitrogen. And so if we want to make a protein, we need nitrogen. So plants get nitrogen from the soil. Often plants don't grow very well because they don't have enough nitrogen, so we give them nitrogen fertilizer. What do you think they use that nitrogen fertilizer for? Hint, hint, hint. So now we're on part 2 of the lab. We'll go to this part of the website. It's loading here. And we're going to answer some questions as well. We're going to go to task 3 here. So we have glucose that we're going to break down in cellular respiration here. We're meeting a standard that asks us to illustrate that cellular respiration is a chemical process whereby bonds of food molecules and oxygen molecules are broken and bonds and new compounds are formed, resulting in a net transfer of energy. We're going to use the stored chemical energy in glucose, add that to oxygen gas, and get byproducts of carbon dioxide, water, and some chemical energy that we can use to make ATP, which is very important for cells. So let's start by breaking down glucose. We can break it down again. Well, we built it before. Now we're breaking it down because this is cellular respiration. Plants do cellular respiration and people do cellular respiration. Your dog, your cat, your house plant, the spider in the corner, the other organisms that are living in your house with you that are all doing cellular respiration. They're all breaking down glucose in the presence of oxygen to release that chemical energy stored in glucose by the plant that made the glucose. And now chemical energy is released. Oxygen must also be broken down in aerobic respiration. There is anaerobic respiration, but we're just going to do aerobic respiration right now in the presence of oxygen because as humans, we do cellular respiration mostly in the presence of oxygen. Oxygen's pretty handy. You have lungs because they help you take in oxygen that supports cellular respiration. And your red blood cells help that oxygen travel around your body and get to every single cell, which is pretty amazing. If you look at your capillaries, which are the very, very tiny blood vessels that go by one single cell at a time, you can barely fit a red blood cell through one of those capillaries. So now we're going to build the products of the reaction. We break down glucose and we get carbon dioxide. You can also break down fat for energy, like you might be, if you haven't eaten lunch recently or breakfast, you might be breaking some fat, and you also, when you break down fat, you get carbon dioxide as a product. So if you lose weight, you actually breathe out that weight as carbon dioxide. That's kind of crazy if you think about it. So plants basically gain weight by taking in carbon dioxide to make glucose and cellulose, molecules that plants are made out of. Cellulose is just a big chain of glucose molecules, and it makes up some of the structure of the plant. And we breathe out those carbon dioxide molecules, and plants take them in and use them. So now we're counting our carbon dioxide molecules. Notice how many we made altogether. So out of one glucose, so far we've made 6 carbon dioxides. And we're going to make some water molecules now. We've used up all our carbon in carbon dioxide from the glucose, and now we're going to make water. So for cellular respiration, it runs in reverse from photosynthesis. There's lots of complicated biochemistry in between, but the major overall reactions, the sum of the reactions for photosynthesis and cellular respiration are opposites of each other. Cellular respiration burns glucose. Photosynthesis creates glucose. It doesn't really burn it, it breaks it down. Let's use a better term. And cellular respiration breaks down glucose into carbon dioxide and water, the starting reactants for photosynthesis. So we've got to count our water molecules here. So cellular respiration, remember, is glucose taken in or created if you're a plant, added to some oxygen, which is why we breathe, why we have lungs, why we have red blood cells, and the atoms are rearranged from glucose and that oxygen to make 6 CO2 and 6 waters. That's 6 CO2 and 6 waters from one glucose and some oxygen molecules. And as a result, we get a whole lot of ATP. Let's count here. 1, 2, 3, 4 rows times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What's 9 times 4? 36. 36 ATPs from this reaction. Glucose is a pretty powerful molecule at storing energy. So notice in cellular respiration, bonds in food, glucose, plants make their own food, remember, and oxygen are broken down and the bonds in new compounds, carbon dioxide and water, are formed, resulting in a net transfer of energy, ATP. Okay, we're ready to start part 3. We're going to work on photosynthesis interactive. So go to the website here and we will find the photosynthesis interactive and hit start new game. So here we are at photosynthesis interactive. The game is just loading here. We're going to start a new game. We're going to start with leaf anatomy. Just double click on it. We're going to pilot our ship past the little people who might harm us to the site of photosynthesis. Hopefully you all know that photosynthesis happens in leaves. We're going to zoom in and look at the cells that make up the leaf. So we've got the epidermis, that is kind of like the waxy cuticle. It protects the leaf. The palisade mesophyll cells, we're going to find out something about them in a minute. The spongy mesophyll cells, more epidermis, and some stoma, which are guard cells that let carbon dioxide in and out of the leaf. They also let water in and out of the leaf when they allow carbon dioxide in and out. So leaves kind of tend to, they guard how much the stoma is open or closed. So we want to pilot our ship to where the carbon dioxide is heading here into the palisade mesophyll cells. We're going to shrink and go into our mesophyll cells. So we're going to fly using our up and down arrows. So we're going to pilot our ship into the chloroplast. And the green discs are called thylakoids, and the light-dependent reactions happen here. Those are the reactions that depend on light to excite electrons. The stroma is the fluid surrounding the thylakoids. That's where the Calvin cycle happens. Calvin cycle is part of photosynthesis. So we were at the leaf, we zoomed into a plant cell, and now we're in those chloroplasts. Remember, chloroplasts are organelles that are part of plants. So the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast is where all the action happens here. We're going to zoom in on the thylakoid membrane. So notice where the stroma is, that fluid, and where the thylakoid space is. Now we're going to watch an animation of the light-dependent reactions. We're going to pay close attention because we're going to need to do those reactions on our own here. So the first step here is light is coming into the system and exciting those electrons. They're gaining energy from light. Remember, photosynthesis is all about transforming light energy into chemical energy. Those excited electrons leave and go to photosystem 2. Even though it's the first photosystem they go to, it was the second that was discovered, so they call it photosystem 2. Now it travels down the proteins of the electron transport chain. Some water is split to replace those electrons, so the hydrogen loses to the electron and it goes back to photosystem. Those electrons from hydrogen go to photosystem 2. It also produces some oxygen, which is a bonus for us. The excited electrons continue going down the electron transport chain, which is a lot more complicated than they show it here, but that's okay. The energy from those electrons is used to pump some hydrogen ions across the thylakoid space, so some hydrogen came in. This is resulting in a high concentration of hydrogen and a lower concentration out here in the stroma. So high hydrogen in the thylakoid space and low in the stroma. And we know if we have a difference in concentrations that diffusion can occur. The H+ will naturally move or diffuse from high to low concentration by diffusion, and the only place on the membrane that it's allowed through is a protein called ATP synthase. The diffusion of H+ ions through ATP synthase causes ATP synthase to rotate, and this rotation produces ATP. This ATP will be used during the Calvin cycle as an energy source to help produce sugar, or glucose. The Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma of the chloroplasts. Now let's return to our electrons and finish their journey down the electron transport chain. So they go to photosystem 1, and they move through photosystem 1. They get re-excited by some more light, and they continue down the electron transport chain. They reduce NADPH. That means they put the electrons back into NADPH, and that's going to be used to make organic molecules later. So we've seen the basics of light-dependent reactions. These reactions make the ATP and NADH that are used later in the Calvin cycle to make organic compounds like glucose. Also, notice that the light-dependent reactions use water and make oxygen. So water is very important to plants. They need to get it through the roots. They also need to take in CO2. And they need to have light to power the whole thing. So now it's our turn. Drag and drop on the screen to make light-dependent reactions happen. They'll start with photolysis. So we're going to bring in some light. It strikes the chlorophyll. This causes the electrons to get excited. The electrons move through the transport chain here. We have to break up some water to get some electrons to replace the electrons we took from photosystem 2 here. This also produces hydrogen ions. So we keep moving our electrons down the electron transport chain. That excited energy is used to bring some hydrogen through. This results in a high concentration of hydrogen in the thylakoid space and a low concentration in the stroma. So the hydrogen ions need to go through ATP synthase and make some ATP. The rotation of the hydrogen ions through allows the enzyme here to produce ATP from ADP and a phosphorus. Now let's return to our electrons and help them get through the rest of the way through the electron transport chain. Now we need some more light to continue to power up this process. We'll move the electrons over here. They'll add some electrons to NADPH, and that's used later to make some sugars. We'll skip doing the process a final time. You can do that on your own.